And we're live! Hello, everyone. I am Mark
Hey.
Seifter, like it says underneath here, and I'm joined by...
Hi, I am Linda Zayas Palmer. I am a full-time freelancer and a former
Did you
development
know that by
manager
giving
at
to our
Paizo,
campaign
and I
earlier
work
rather than
primarily
later,
on
you will
Pathfinder
have a
2nd Edition
much greater
content,
impact?
and
And
a
I'm Dr. Nathan
former
Did you
Barling.
know
development
that
I
by
am a research paleontologist at the University of Exeter in the UK. I'm also director of Paleo Games Limited. It's a company that makes some dino-themed D&D content and now Pathfinder content.
Alright, so everyone, I'm here to let you know that, sometimes Steven puts something on the title card that'll be like a shocking statement that's diagonal. And this time I actually asked him to put on the don't make this one mistake. And we're not going to clickbait you on this. We're not going to make you wait until the end of the episode. There is one big mistake that is often made when converting between Pathfinder and D&D 5e, either direction. Usually it's 5e to Pathfinder. And we're just going to tell you right at the beginning and show you how to avoid it too. The mistake is taking what you see from one system and thinking you can convert it like you might do from like English to French or Spanish to French, some language that's very similar, where you just plug in a different word for the word that you're saying and keep your sentences the same when you're doing in this analogy in the foreign language translation. The similar thing would be to take the exact mechanics that you found in the D&D 5e and just convert to similar terminology in Pathfinder 2. This is a huge mistake, and it's often one that is made by first-time converters. I have often talked to people who have said that they are hesitant to check out conversions between the two systems because the first time they did, they found something that was converted too literally, and it turned out that it wasn't as fun to play in the other edition. So the way that you fix this, and what we're going to be spending a lot of this episode talking about in various tips and tricks to do it right, is that you need to go deeper. Don't just do a surface level translation, but understand the core concept, what the creator of the content was getting at, what they wanted to share with the players and the readers. And then you take that core and you faithfully convert it into the new edition by creating something brand new, but also that will be familiar to anybody who had seen the original.
So here we're going to be taking a look as an example, and why we have Dr. Nathan Barling on here today is a project that I am working on converting is the Dr. Droland's Dictionary of Dinosaurs from 5th edition D&D into Pathfinder 2nd edition. And so in order to take a look at this, the first thing that I needed to make sure is that I understood sort of the aim and the goal of the project. So can you talk to us a little bit, Nathan, about what is it that inspired you to make this project and what you're hoping to achieve with it?
Sure. So primarily this is a paleontology outreach project. So part of my job, if you will, as a scientific researcher is to disseminate knowledge. And things have been a bit rocky in the UK over the last few years. So I came up with the idea to kind of try and weave my hobbies, which are tabletop gaming and role playing, into my research and into a way that I can actually do scientific outreach. So what we decided to do, me and my colleague Michael, we decided to take all of our knowledge of paleontology and try and update, specifically for D&D, update the dinosaurs and the other Mesozoic reptiles that are really quite poorly represented in that system. Not only just in their artistic depictions, which are quite outdated, but also in their sort of mechanical depictions. They don't really behave like animals. They don't have abilities or attacks that are actually representative of their biology. So we thought, well, this is a golden opportunity to be able to create something fun, fund ourselves for a little bit of time, and also like get really good paleontological outreach into the wider community.
Awesome. So with that being the main goal of the project as a whole, I think that makes it clear that one of the most important things in converting is that the Pathfinder 2 version also would need to be biologically accurate. Because if you don't do that, even if maybe it seemed like it was a direct conversion from the 5th edition, if something about Pathfinder 2nd edition changed that direct conversion, it could wind up leading to straying away from the fundamental goal. So for you who are watching out there, think about this not only in terms of an individual creature or ancestry or item that you're trying to convert and what that does, but the overall sort of structure of any project. If you have maybe you bought a book in 5th edition and you just love it. You've used it in 5th edition all the time, but you want to convert the whole thing to your Pathfinder 2 game at home. You're not a professional publisher, but you think you can do it, and you probably can. You don't know what their goal was necessarily unless they had a foreword, but try to think about it. What did it bring to the table? What did you love about it? Even if it wasn't the creator's goal, there may be something emergent, kind of death of the author-y, where you found something in it that they didn't even think of. And whatever that is, that's your high concept.
Yeah. So when taking a look at that on sort of a mechanic for mechanic basis, let's say that a creature, has advantage on stealth checks within the water when it's in the water. That doesn't, the part of that matters isn't the part that says it has advantage and like that exact mechanical representation. The part of it that matters is this creature is particularly good at stealth when they're in the water, and they're better at stealthing in the water than they are when they're not in the water, right? It's representing that concept, not necessarily the exact numerical way that it's implemented.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I'm kind of I was in a fortunate enough position when we decided to port this project over to Pathfinder. Well, I'm primarily a D&D player. That's what my local group plays in, and all of my local game groups are doing. But I've played enough Pathfinder to know that it's not a direct port, and that was kind of that. I managed to skip that real first hurdle of doing it and then it messing up, realizing that actually no, I need to get someone who really does know this very, very well. And I think the first thing that was mentioned was also the flight rules, the like for ancestries, having a hidden level cap on flight. Probably not so hidden for players familiar with Pathfinder, but it was very, very surprising to me, and I was like, oh, okay, yeah, good thing we've done this then.
Yeah, so one of the ancestries in this book, in 5th edition, you can have a species or a race that flies from level 1, whereas in Pathfinder, you can kind of start off with some hovery, like don't take damage type stuff, and then upgrade along, trajectories that you'll see in other ancestries to get true flight now with the errata as early as level 9. But then what that meant for the ancestry is, you need to have some kind of a story reason as well. Why can't all of the children of Seth just fly freely through the skies? So, then you start getting into things like, well, okay, maybe certain members of that ancestry become grounded and they lose their ability to fly. But what that means in their culture is that they have a great destiny. They're going to be a hero. They may have some more trials ahead of them, but they're going to be the ones who are leaders, who are innovators, who are brave, that sort of thing. So sometimes that there's a conversation that takes place between the mechanics and the story behind it, so that they both synergize together.
Absolutely. Now, there was a question from chat that I'm going to answer because it's relevant to something that was not in Dr. Drollin's Dictionary of Dinosaurs. That is actually one of the tricky spots for converting, but that I have done in a conversion when I was helping out some of the people at DM layer to convert something, which is, what about converting an adventure? When you're converting an adventure, especially one that has brand new monsters in it, and if the adventure is supposed to be for, let's say, 15th level characters, because it gets worse the higher the level the characters are, what can you do about the fact that Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder build encounters very differently? in Pathfinder, 2 creatures who are of level X, let's say 10, are equivalent to 1 creature that's 2 levels higher in the encounter builder that's level 12, would be equivalent to 2 level 10. In D&D's original encounter builder, you could fight like 3 Otyugs at level 15, and it was supposedly very challenging. Now, they released some updated ones that readjusted away some of those multipliers, but it still didn't get you that many more Otyugs at level 15 that you would fight for a challenging encounter. Whereas in Pathfinder 2, if you were fighting level 5 creatures at level 15 and they were supposed to be a challenging encounter, you would be fighting like hundreds of them. And it also wouldn't be recommended to fight hundreds of creatures of that level. So this actually means when you're converting adventures that you have to be very careful about what you do. You might need to switch to completely different creatures if they're pre-made creatures, because there may be no, if it's high level, there might be no number of the creatures that were in the original D&D adventure, if you're starting there, that you could possibly port over to Pathfinder. In one case, I was converting an adventure for them, or the creatures anyway, because the main text was mostly fine, that was extremely high level. It was about like a swarm of creatures that, like, there was like a hive queen, and it spawned like all sorts of different versions of the creature, and they would just like devour everything and grow. And the drones were like level 2 originally, but I worked with them, and they already actually had a good sense of the encounter building, so they realized as soon as I said anything that they needed to do this. So we made the drones like level 14, I think. They were like 12 levels higher than the original version. It wasn't even close. And you might have to do that when you're converting a high level adventure. Revamp it, make a different creature, make a like a mythical or legendary version of it if you have art. And it's like, well, no, we have art that shows that there's just like a couple of chokers attacking these high level PCs that won't work. So maybe these are some kind of legendary choker that still looks roughly like a choker. There's lots of tricks you can use. It is even more so than usual. Do not get shoehorned into just doing what the original adventure did when you're converting it. So that's my answer to that question.
We did have a very minor aspect of that in this book, where there was the level differential between the young Tyrannosaurus and the Tyrannosaurus in Pathfinder, because Tyrannosaurus was lower level in D&D than it is in Pathfinder. So if we kept the young Tyrannosaurus at its original level, you would basically be like, you could barely at level 9 encounter the 2 at the same time if it was a very hard severe encounter under like specific conditions. But by saying, you know, what's more important here, you know, let's take a look at how strong is the young Tyrannosaurus compared to the adult Tyrannosaurus, then we're able to change the level. So now we say, okay, you know, 9th and 10th and 11th level PCs can all fight combined encounters. You can have hard encounters, you can have easy encounters, you can specialize it in all sorts of different ways. So like that was a really useful conversation to have with Nathan there, and be like, you know, is it more important that young Tyrannosaurus is exactly this powerful? Is it more important like the way that it would be used in encounters?
So I have a question for Nathan on that front. Because
Sure.
one of the delights in Pathfinder 2nd Edition when we rebalanced some of the levels of creatures was when Logan and I would sit down and be like, okay, who would win in a fight, a troll or an owlbear? And if we were like, it's about the same, it's like, okay, maybe the same level. Or if we were like, no, it would definitely be the troll. It's got all these other things. We might have made it a level higher. Did you and your co-authors get to do a who would win in a fight thing about the various Mesozoic reptiles and dinosaurs in the book to decide what level they were, and be like, well, we know from the fossil record that this one would usually only attack that one if it had a bunch of them, so it's probably weaker?
The short answer, well, the honest answer to that is that I don't think a day has gone by in my academic career where me or any of my peers have not had a dinosaur battle in our heads or on tables, or every single day was like, who's going to win? Is it going to be T-Rex or is it going to be Spinosaurus? And obviously, we sit down and spend far too much time figuring that out. I can answer specifics for that if you'd like. A T-Rex would win against Spinosaurus, I think, but they probably wouldn't bother fighting. They fill different ecological niches, and so would probably steer clear of each other most likely. But the young Tyrannosaurus was a really interesting conversation, because the reason we wanted to put that animal in specifically is because a young Tyrannosaurus actually fills a different ecological niche than the adult form. So we have this measure called ontogenetic changes that animals undergo as they age, and that can be anything from growing horns to growing display feathers. But with tyrannosaurs, they do appear to actually fulfill a different role within the ecosystem. And so we wanted to use the young Tyrannosaurus as a means to represent that and provide that education. And so the actual power level of that animal is then always going to be relative to the adult form in whatever game system that it's in. So that's one of the reasons why we wanted to have it, and we did want to have the opportunity to be able to have you fighting a young Tyrannosaurus and an adult, partly because of the optional the fantasy rules for that one, where we reenact the Jurassic Park 2 cliff scene where the infant calls out for help and then the adults come along. So, yeah, that was one of the key things that we wanted to hold on to, and so the actual level, the CR of that creature was almost irrelevant to our design to it.
Awesome. So let's take a look at some specific examples. We've given a little bit of a philosophy. It was a little bit of a drawn back statement about, well, you need to look at what the high concept is and reimagine it. But let's get down to brass tacks and give some very specific examples of how this would be done to show people so that they can do it in their own games. What do you two think would be a good first dinosaur or Mesozoic reptile to use as an example of this?
Shall we take a look at the Spinosaurus?
Sure. Yeah. And just so everyone will probably be able to see, I've got my beaten up display copy of the book here that I'll be flicking through as well. So apologies if you hear pages turning.
Awesome. So I think a lot of people have heard of Spinosaurus, but not everyone who's watching it might have. So, Nathan, could you introduce people to Spinosaurus, like the dinosaur, and then discuss a little bit about how you built the 5th edition version of it?
Goodness, where do we start with Spinosaurus? So it is a very, very large theropod dinosaur. So it's a 2-legged meat-eating dinosaur, but it's now thought to be largely piscivorous, so mostly eating fish. And it's from Africa. It's not as big as T-Rex, but I believe it's longer. It's not as heavy, but it's one of the big ones. Most people will probably know it from like Jurassic Park 3, and that's actually a very outdated reconstruction of the animal. It's got much shorter hind limbs than that, and so it's really, as far as dinosaurs go, it's a crocodile mimic. Really, it's very similar in lots of ways to modern crocodiles. So it's most well known for its massive fin on the back, which is where it gets its name from, the spines that held that up. But in terms of the animal and how we wanted to design it, we wanted to basically try and represent this macro predator, but we also think it was quite abundant in the region that it was in. So we've reflected that in the region's rules rather than Spinosaurus itself. But it's very much a semi-aquatic animal. It spends a lot of time in and around water. There's ongoing research. I mean, this is the thing with Spinosaurus, is that it's so controversial. Every year it totally changes based on new research. But we're fairly confident now within the field of science that we're looking at an animal that's largely aquatic. So that's the main thing really about it.
So you said that the commonality was represented largely in the other stuff. In Pathfinder, we actually had a conversation before where you mentioned to me that this one, unlike a lot of the larger dinosaurs, would be common instead of uncommon to represent its relative prevalence. So that was another toggle that we had in Pathfinder, that that wasn't there in D&D is to say, okay, your large predators aren't going to be as abundant as the prey.
Yeah, very much so. And again, this is kind of so I don't know the exact metrics for measuring how abundant this animal would have been in its environment, but it's generally reported that there's an overabundance of large predators in the Bahare Formation. And the main thing really is that it's because it's a very very productive waterway. You're not looking at the same environmental controls on the populations of animals there versus terrestrial predators. If you've got animals on land that are having to actively hunt, they're limited by the amount of prey or how easy that prey is to catch. Whereas if you've got lots of large predators in water, their prey can only get so far. It's still have to catch it, but they can only get so far, and there might be a lot more of it. It's one of the reasons why I think we see a lot more. You get very, very large numbers of crocodiles in small confined spaces, and they're able to do all right. So I think that's somewhat reflective of the situation here. Although I must stress, I am not a vertebrate paleontologist. I'm what's called a taphonomist. So I study preservation and decay. So I have a pretty good understanding, probably better than most of the general population when it comes to dinosaurs. But Michael O'Sullivan, Dr. Michael O'Sullivan, is really the main guy for providing a lot of the sort of vertebrate behavior in this case as well.
So if anyone was on this and watched the episode where we had Hannah on here, who had done kind of research and study at college on fairy tales and was like, oh, you know what, I'm not an expert on fairy tales. I only have a degree in fairy tales. The actual experts are X. You can tell when someone is pretty much an expert when they deny that they're an expert, give their exact subfield, and point out that there's another subfield that's even more of an expert than they are. And so I guess I'm not surprised to hear that again.
It's like the PhD effect, right? Everyone's always going to be like, but these people are more experts than I am in this field. You should listen to them.
Absolutely.
The funny thing is that Michael probably would say that he's not an expert either. He would say, well, he works on pterosaur phylogenetics and therefore is it's not one to comment on dinosaur behavior. We did actually work with Dr. David Hone as well, though. He was our editors. He wasn't an author, and he genuinely is like the tyrannosaur guy. So yeah, we did have some really, really big hitters on it, but we're not slouches, I suppose. We spent a lot of time reading for the book, mind you, so a lot of papers gone through.
Right. No, I mean, I'm used to it. I remember when I was starting at Paizo, it was like early on, someone asked me online about like how tall is the wind spout of a whirlwind for an air elemental if its size is a particular size and it has this much mass, because it didn't say exactly how tall it went. And I was like, well, I've got 3 physics PhDs in my group, so I'll ask them. And they said, Mark, our specialty isn't fluid dynamics. What are you talking about? We have no idea how tall that would be. So this is just how it is.
Very much so.
All right,
Absolutely.
so let's take a look more into detail about Spinosaurus. So in order to get across that high concept that we were talking about, this crocodilomorph type, mostly aquatic but able to go on both kind of creature, what kind of abilities did the 5th edition version have to express that?
So
I'll let you. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Talk about the 5th edition version first.
Okay, so for the 5th edition version, we gave it an ability called Crocodile Mimic, which basically it lets it hold its breath for 30 minutes. That's a little bit of a little bit of an extrapolation based on the actual morphology of the animal. We suspect it may have been able to hold its breath for a while, but obviously the exact number is just but the other thing that we know that this animal had is pressure sensors in its snout, and these would have been most likely used for holding the head in water, and then when a fish moves within the jaws, quick snap shut. And so in 5th edition, I wanted to give this animal a blind sight. blind sight of 10 feet so long as it's in water. And you might think, oh, a 10-foot blind sight's not massively important, but there's other stuff in the book that makes water opaque. So if you're in water and it's basically, you get the blinded condition, having that blind sight has a massive impact in combat. So and we wanted to represent that aspect of this animal's ecology in that ability.
Awesome. So that's what it was looking at in 5th edition. So Linda, when you came across this Spinosaurus, what did you take into account based on both the rules that Nathan had included, plus all the paleontology info that was in the book, and any sort of conversations you had? How did you figure out how to like reimagine and create the Pathfinder 2 version of this Spinosaurus?
So when it came to the crocodile mimic ability, the first thing I did is say, okay, it's called crocodile mimic, so let me take a look at the crocodile and how is the crocodile's breath holding represented. And so that's represented by an ability called deep breath, which is just it can hold its breath for however amount of time. So I was thinking, okay, I can just give it the same ability that the crocodile has with the same phrasing, and that shows, hey, it's got the same thing the crocodile's got going on. For the blind sight, Pathfinder doesn't have a broad thing that's called blind sight. It's based on how do they figure out what's going on. So I had a conversation with Nathan about, okay, how does their blind sight work? Is it something that's based more on like feeling the pressure and the movement in the water, or is it something that's based on echolocation? And so he told me that it's about what he was just saying here. And then I was thinking, okay, well, that's going to be more like wave sense, where you feel the movements in the water. So I call that then wave sense. And then wave sense, in 5e it says blind sight but only in the water, but the mechanics for wave sense are already capture the you're underwater and you feel the pressure in the waves. So I don't need to put like a separate ability description for it. Since wave sense is already a defined thing in Pathfinder, I can just put wave sense up in its senses, and then that covers it. And then the 10 feet range. Because the 10-foot range is a mechanically important thing, but not like exactly what you call it. Another thing that the Spinosaurus in 5e has a reactionary thermoregulation, so that it can use a reaction to gain immunity to fire or cold damage. So looking at this, a lot of times in 5th edition, you'll have a lot more immunities than Pathfinder. So some of the kinds of things that D&D might be trying to communicate with immunity are something that Pathfinder would communicate with a resistance, right? So in Pathfinder, if you're immune to fire, you're like literally a fire elemental. You could jump in lava and be fine. Like that's what immunity to fire means in Pathfinder. So then I'm going to be looking to convert this to something like gaining a resistance to cold or fire against a triggering attack. And so that's the kind of thing that reaction does, because that still gets across the idea of dramatic thermoregulation without saying, without saying I could literally be standing on the South Pole or drop into a pool of lava and be fine.
I mean, for 5th edition, I suppose it's not too dissimilar, really. And but this actually the immunity came out from playtesting for this animal. So we originally designed it. So it's because the animal has the large sail, which we believe was used for thermoregulation. We wanted to put that in a way that's mechanically fun. So we introduced, that it can use its reaction to either flush the sail with blood or pull blood from it to change how it's affected by extreme temperatures. But because this is a relatively high CR creature, and we have other creatures in the book that have large sails and have a similar ability, we wanted to differentiate it from them. And we found through playtesting that, basically they're like, well, you can give it resistance, but then it's very similar to this, and at this high level, it's not as impactful. It's still impactful, but let's give it immunity and make it really, really really good. So that's obviously a slight deviation from the actual science. You can't make a Spinosaurus immune to fire in real life. It's still going to get hurt by it. But I felt like it was a good middle ground of fun gameplay mechanics and science education, and hopefully it prompts people to read the text to find out a bit more about the animal as well.
I
Yeah,
think
I think
it's an
that
example of how in D&D you only had 2 toggles. And so you had to make a sacrifice, a small sacrifice that I think people are going to know that you can't catapult a Spinosaurus into the sun and have it survive that by, because it has sails on its back. But it was a small sacrifice in verisimilitude and the biology in order, for gameplay, because resistance wasn't enough to justify like a reaction on a higher level creature. And fortunately in Pathfinder, by not doing direct conversion, Linda was able to presumably identify that, she said that resistance can be any number you want in Pathfinder. So the other creatures could have a small resistance, and Spinosaurus could get a big one when it uses its reaction.
That's exactly what I did. So I gave it about the highest resistance you possibly can have on a creature of that level. So it's got resistance 10, which means that it does the reaction and then it's going to cut 10 off of any cold or fire damage that it takes. So that means, if it's what that also means is that if it's in an area that has very strong environmental heat or cold, and it's would be taking 1d6 damage from over time with that, it just doesn't care. It's fine. So I figured
I'm guessing
that
based on that the reaction lets it toggle, but then it keeps the resistance after that, based on your description there. Because if it was only resistance against the one thing it was reacting to, it would probably be higher, and then it would only apply to that one thing. This is just a different way that Pathfinder can express things, and in this case, it helps it be even a little bit, just that slightly bit more accurate, even though obviously nobody is measuring the bones of a Spinosaurus and being like, if I was to convert this compared to a fireball, I would say its spine allows it to ignore this percentage of a fireball.
And I also think too that like if this project wasn't so strongly rooted in scientific accuracy, I might have just been like, yeah, immunity's cool, that's fine. But because it does have that strong rooting, whenever there's a case where I think that there might be a way to be a little more accurate using the Pathfinder rules, I've been looking for those avenues as well. So, because you can have little resistances or big resistances, and you can have resistances that are always on or that are reactive, and you can have, does this happen every time they take that type of damage or just under a certain circumstance? You can have the variability in that way, which I thought was really interesting. And some other things in this one is that, and this is actually something that that is in Pathfinder a lot, I noticed. So the action to frighten others in Pathfinder, demoralize, has a clause in it where if you don't share a language with the person you're trying to frighten, you take a -4 penalty. So, you don't see those kinds of threat display tactics that often on animals in Pathfinder, but in terms of being accurate to the fact that, in the wild, dinosaurs wouldn't have always been like, let's just jump straight for the throat, right? They would have tried to other strategies that are, like you have in the behavior tables in this, Nathan, you talk about, dinosaurs that may have used threat displays or other strategies other than, taking the risk of getting right up there and fighting.
Yeah, so we actually, I think, leaned into intimidation for 5e quite a lot throughout the book. Primarily because with the introduction of the behavior tables and our descriptions of the behaviors of the animals, there's a lot of options for non-combat encounters. And the reality is, for large carnivores specifically, they spend most of their time sleeping. So that's kind of boring if you just say, oh, you come across this animal, it's asleep and it ignores you. You want that to be a possibility, but you don't want that to be happening all the time. And also, herbivores are generally quite territorial. They can be quite nasty, especially large herbivores. So most of these animals, modern animals, will do some sort of threat display before attacking. Few animals really just go for the kill immediately, unless they're actively hunting, like hunting you. They will typically try and spook you off, because the reality is in life, if you get an injury, if you get a minor injury, that can get infected and kill you. So most animals avoid conflict where possible. So we gave a lot of the animals in the book either abilities that can give them advantage or another bonus to intimidation, and also just bonuses to their intimidation as a stat, because we didn't want it to just be tied to charisma. And yeah, you can rule it as a strength. You can use strength potentially, but that's not always done by every DM. So we wanted to give a lot of the animals bonuses to intimidation, and they're learning the kind of almost incompatibility with that with Pathfinder's system was really interesting, and actually discussing workarounds and ways to make it viable was a great learning experience of the system, and really interesting.
Yeah, so in because in D&D, even if a creature isn't trained in intimidation, they can still roll it and they can still try it and they'll still have a decent chance. But because in Pathfinder, if you're untrained in a skill, you're falling so far behind in terms of not having training, in terms of not adding your level as a bonus. You're by the time that you're level 9, somebody who's not trained in something versus someone who's good at it, that's a difference of 20 in your bonus. So you're really not going to succeed at that point. So we have this conversation about, if an animal should be able to intimidate, we can put intimidation on its sheet. And, those ones that we kind of added as, hey, yeah, they should be able to kind of do this, but this is not their main thing. What I did then is I'm looking at the skill modifiers in the making monsters thing, is I'm not going to give them the high modifier because that's not their specialty, but they're more like middle, medium, or low because they can do it. But they're not going to be great at it, but they have a chance of success. And then because we needed some ability to kind of get around this -4 going on, I put in an ability for each of the creatures that's, intimidating something. And then I'm like, okay, well, each of these creatures has some way that it intimidates people. Nathan, how did everything do a threat display? And then he gets back to me like, almost right after, and it's like, sorry this took so long, and then sends me this giant list of like, okay, well, these ones intimidated with their like showing off their defenses because they've got razor sharp osteoderms, and you can just see those are going to cut you, or this one would hiss, or this one would bellow, or something like that. And then so with all that information, it was really nice to just be able to put in, here's the name of the defense, bellow, and then I'm talking about like it has a deep roar or something like that. So then there's also an evocative sentence for like how does it scare you. And the same thing then comes about for some other things too. Intimidation was the one I definitely needed to ask for help on, because I don't know what it looks like to intimidate, but I do know what it looks like to sneak. And by the same token, in Pathfinder, if you're not trained in stealth, you're not sneaking. So like then I'm looking through all the scientific information that's been provided to me in the book, and like if it ever talks about like hiding or ambushing or anything other than saying like these were giant dinosaurs, they didn't hide, they were just there, you're not gonna miss this gargantuan creature in your backyard, then I'm gonna give it like at least a little bit of an ability to conceal itself.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you sit and sort of think about real animals and things like intimidation displays and stealthiness. The thing I always default back to is thinking about, for intimidation, is cows and bulls. And you can think, right, this is a large herbivore. Would this be intimidating? And you think, well, when a bull does a mock charge, that's pretty scary. And that behavior is still actually, present in even domesticated cows. And then just trying to extrapolate that and how other animals would behave in certain ways. Obviously, that's a mammal and these are dinosaurs, and so it's slightly different. But yeah, I really really enjoyed going through that list and thinking, no, really, how would this animal be be trying to intimidate? Is it going to be making a loud call? Is it going to be doing a dance or a threat display or all of the above? And trying to figure out ways to describe it that are, as you said, evocative and helping the GM and the players imagine what's actually happening.
Awesome.
And there were other considerations in the skills too. Like for example, in Pathfinder, if a creature has an ability to grab you or to knock you down or something like that, those abilities in Pathfinder are always going to require them to roll an athletics check.
At least as of the remaster.
At least as of the remaster, yes. So that means that, you know, I need to make sure that all of the creatures that are supposed to be grabbing you and knocking you down and things like that, they've got athletics. Or, you know, if a creature is good at climbing or has a climb speed or something like that, then it's gonna have some athletics to do that. Or if a creature, you know, if a creature can fly, you know, it's got to have that acrobatics to maneuver in flight. So there's some things to consider for like what are the abilities that the creature has and like what skills is that going to imply to make sure they can do everything that the concept has them doing. And you're not going to have a situation where like, you know, oops, my pterosaur can't maneuver in the air and it just falls out of the sky.
Unless it's supposed to be really clumsy and can only go straight and can't really make sharp turns,
well, there are some really interesting things
sometimes.
Yeah, there are some really interesting things with pterosaur flight in here though that Nathan did with like them launching with their powerful quads off of the ground. So instead of just saying like, oh yeah, you know, I can just poop and now I'm flying fast suddenly 100 feet off that way. They've got this powerful launch that they do, and it shakes the ground when they do that, and they can knock people over, and then they go up a little bit, and after that they can zoom however they want. Or if they like drop from if they drop from something high up, then they can swoop and they can do it. But I think that stuff like that was really cool to work with because, you know, that's an example of something like this is, you know, maybe it's not the conventional way that flight works in, you know, in Pathfinder or whatever, but it's evocative and it's cool and it works. And so we're able to represent that within the system.
And that's also, it's a really interesting point really as well, in that we're dealing with animals here that we often don't have modern representatives for, particularly pterosaurs, right? And they flew and had sort of functional mechanics that are different to anything that's alive today. So there's actually a long and interesting history of research into pterosaur flight mechanics, and it's only in the last, I would say maybe decade, it's probably more than a decade now, we've known that these animals quad launched. So they sort of sprung from the ground with all four limbs, particularly the larger pterosaurs. And we wanted to make that really clear that that's how they are flying, and that is only how they fly, and then provide a mechanical reason have that happen in combat. And so making it a big gust of wind and a thud knocks the players over if you're too close, which, mind you, if you're talking about a very large Azhdarchid pterosaur, the Quetzalcoatlus and Haxagopteryx type animals, then you're going to get, there's a lot of air that needs to be displaced to get that into the sky. So yeah, I think it's not unreasonable that a human or a halfling standing next to them is gonna go 5 foot back when it takes off.
And plop on the ground.
So maybe let's look at one more creature next that has a different style of conversion techniques that needed to be used so that we can demonstrate some more. What would be another good one to talk about for that, Linda, since you were the one who was converting them?
I think the Paralititan would be a fun one to look at for that.
Conveniently
close in the book, which I quite
Indeed.
like.
There we go. So Nathan, give us the introduction to this one, because I think that unlike Spinosaurus, which I would consider like a second tier in popular knowledge dinosaur, where like Stegosaurus, Triceratops is the top. Everybody knows those, even if they don't like dinosaurs. The people who like dinosaurs know Spinosaurus. I think most people don't know Paralititan at all. So tell us a little bit about this and how you made the 5th edition version, and then we can hear Linda talk about the conversion.
Sure. So Paralititan is a sauropod dinosaur, so it's one of the long-necked, very, very, very large dinosaurs. And of that group, it is a titanosaur. So it is the biggest of the big. Let me be cheeky and grab. I don't know if this will focus, but here's our artwork for it. That's a Spinosaurus in front of it. Given this is supposed to be a small Spinosaurus and then the maximum size, so sort of smallest and maximum, but still adults. These are really, really big animals, like seriously large. Not blue whale sized, but not far off. And I wanted to make that. I thought to myself, if you're just a little guy and you're fighting this thing, what are you supposed to do against it? It's so big, and yeah, okay, fantasy role-playing games have ludicrously huge giants and stuff, but I want to try and capture in this book these animals as though they were real life. And yeah, there's ways you can circumvent some of the things I'm going to discuss. So we gave it an ability called immutable stature, which basically makes it immune to non-magical slashing, piercing, and bludgeoning damage. It's just too big. You're trying to hit it with a mundane sword. You're not even going to cut the skin. Like, it's just so large. So that was one of the things we wanted to do with it. And then the other was that if an animal that big just steps on you, you're just flattened. So we gave it a huge stomp, but we wanted to evoke the idea of if it rears up and stamps down, that's going to be a really, really powerful attack. So we came up with this rear up ability where it can rear up for a turn and then its speed is reduced to 0, so it can't move. But if you're silly enough to stay next to it, it's just going to squish you. And the other thing as well, we made this animal very, very slow. And because of that, and these immunities, we did lots of playtesting. We did an awful lot of playtesting with Paralititan, and we had to give it an immense amount of hit points because it's such an easy creature to kite. Like, you can just with a +1 bow, you can defeat it by just moving away from it. But yeah, we had to kind of work around that as well. So we gave it a bellow and call ability as well to kind of frighten people. So if you're just trying to ping away at it and kite it for ages, yes, you can do it. It would take a very, 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 very long time. And yeah, it was a challenging animal to balance through the playtesting, I would say, just because largely of the speed. But anyway, that's me getting into the stat blocks. But the main thing about it is that this is a really, seriously, really big animal.
When considering that for Pathfinder, because in Pathfinder, magic weapons are part of the expectation as early as like level 2 characters are all gonna have magic weapons. So that particular protection isn't going to get across that idea in Pathfinder. So instead, what I did for that is a resistance to physical wounds from most sources. So if attacks from huge or larger creatures, as well as like massive ranged weapons and physical spell attacks, could bypass its resistance to physical damage, but not other things. So like if you shoot arrows at it, whatever, it's got the resistance. If you need to get like a siege weapon, you need to hit this thing with like a catapult or a ballista or something like that if you want to get past that resistance. And then when you take a look at the and then there's a thing in here about like, it always fails like all sorts of reflex saves, but it can't be tripped. Because Pathfinder doesn't have immunities as commonly, what I did with this is it's fortitude save because it's big and chunky and defensive. It uses the extreme values, like the top that you can possibly have. And then its reflex save is terrible. It literally uses the terrible values on the sheet. So its reflex save is plus 10 higher than its its fortitude is 10 higher than its reflex. So, this thing, same result, is going to be like critically succeeding at fortitude saves when it fails reflex saves, right? It's just ridiculous. But then it has an ability where when it comes to being tripped, it can always use its fortitude DC, its fortitude to defend against that. So it has a like above normal possible for its level defense against being tripped. Good luck at that. Like maybe if you critically succeed, you'll do something. But if you're using, if you're going to try to hit with a fireball, like it's probably going to critically fail and take massive damage. So because a lot of times in Pathfinder, and this is a little bit what I was getting into with the with talking about like the fire immunity and things like before, Pathfinder is a lot more like cautious about giving out full immunity. It's a lot more likely to want to make it so like trying to do this is a very bad idea that's very unlikely to succeed. And like if something is actually immune to being tripped, it's like I am an ooze, I have no legs, the concept of tripping means nothing to me. Whereas like for something like this, then in Pathfinder, just making it have ridiculously good defenses against being tripped was more appropriate there. Then for the abilities, in D&D you don't have a lot of actions going on. So like whereas in Pathfinder, this is something that I was thinking about a lot, is in converting the abilities, how to move them over to that sort of 3 action per round system. And so a lot of these sort of big attacks and big abilities then became 2 or 3 action type things to pull off. So this almighty stomp I saw here just has so much damage. Like it's rearing up and then it's stomping down on you for so much. So to sort of represent the fact that takes a lot of setup on the part of the creature, I made it a 3 action activity. So first it rears up and then it goes boom. So it's still that idea of you can avoid this, but don't be standing right next to the giant. Like please, you can still avoid it in the same way, but it's likely to happen in the Pathfinder setting because we have those extra actions that we can put into it. Because in Pathfinder, a 3 action activity is like your big summon spell or your giant wall spell or the thing that's like, okay, seriously, you let them do their whole thing, it's gonna be big, and that let me preserve that idea of it being super damaging. Whereas compared to like the sort of regular huge stomp, was then sort of regular huge stomp is just sort of like, okay, it when it does its normal attack against you, it has in Pathfinder you can have like knockdown. So it's like, okay, you trip the thing that you hit with your regular attack. So then you retain that idea of I regularly smack you and knock you over, and I rear up and I smack 2 of you for lots of damage and I knock you over. And then that worked really well. One thing too with the frightening things in that creatures have. In D&D you have frightened, which makes you're afraid and you run away, and you can kind of keep making saves against it to come back and be like, oh, I'm okay. And in Pathfinder 2nd edition, the frightened condition is something that gives you penalties instead of making you run away. And then the fleeing condition is something that really only comes into play in more dramatic circumstances. But the frightened condition also, it's something you recover from turn by turn. So you don't really need another ongoing save because you're already going to get better from being frightened. But then because this creature is so scary, I then put in the fact that if you critically fail, then you are fleeing still. You're frightened and you're fleeing. So you're taking -3s to all sorts of checks and you're running away, and you're just not in a good place.
Cool. So I think those 2 examples gave a lot of meat to our discussion about how to convert creatures in between from 5e to Pathfinder 2 and make them an awesome Pathfinder 2 creature. I want to talk a little bit about some of the principles that were behind those techniques. For one, it helped a lot that the Dr. Drolin's Dictionary of Dinosaurs were very interesting and dynamic 5th edition creatures to begin with. There
Absolutely.
are a certain number of 5th edition creatures, even some that are fairly iconic and have a cool backstory and art, that just don't have much in the way of abilities. They're just kind of like a bag of numbers and, oh, they have multi-attack, and like that's kind of all they do. Those can actually be harder to convert in some ways because you have to kind of like it's like crushing a stone to try to get water out of it. You have to come up with some kind of cool idea where none actually originally existed beyond the multi-attack, which there's only so much you can do with that. And so it certainly helps if the 5th edition creature already has cool abilities. It's one reason at Roll for Combat we prefer converting Pathfinder 2 to 5e, is that you kind of were forced to create the abilities. And I feel they make for better 5th edition monsters anyway if they do include those, like the ones in the original Dictionary of Dinosaurs. So I feel like we get monsters that are great in both systems guaranteed that way. But Dr. Droland's is going to have it because those monsters specifically came up with the special abilities, unlike even some of the official monsters for D&D in some cases.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that when I started looking at this, I was expecting, more typical 5e monsters, and I was thinking, okay, I'm going to be spending a fair bit of time like reading the descriptions probably, and then like coming up with how to represent this mechanically. But instead, it's like, oh wow, there's all sorts of cool abilities. It's a matter of like, which of these can I translate? And most of the abilities can be translated to something that does that follows that niche thematically, even if they don't work mechanically the exact same way. Things like, like how multi-attack, in 5e, all sorts of things have multi-attack, but usually in Pathfinder, you're just going to be like, yeah, well, you can already mix up your attack. So unless it's like feels like it's really important to that creature because there's some other special thing going on when it claws you multiple times or something like that, then it's just like, yeah, it has these different strikes it can do. Or like, and then legendary actions, I think, were sort of the last thing that was like more interesting to convert, because that sort of idea of here's the thing that you do in between other people's turns just doesn't exist in the same way. So then those things got converted in a variety of different ways. There's some that became actions that the creature takes on its turn. There's some that, if it's something that feels like it would react to a very specific trigger, that converted into a reaction. And there were a few that, I just thought that 5e legendary actions and being able to do things like at that convenient time after someone else's turn were just too fun. And you can do that within the reaction system. Like there's one of them that like, it's like somebody's turn ends, it moves. And so then the player's like, oh, we figured this out. Oh, wait, what? It's not where I thought it was. It's not next to me anymore. And I just thought that was so much fun. So some of them still kept that, even though it wasn't necessarily standard to Pathfinder. So I think there's a bit of an art to deciding, like, when do you want to let a little bit of that other system creep in when it's still compatible, even if it's not, like, standard.
So I have a quick question, sorry, for both of you. Is that in that light, do you feel that this is maybe a cheeky question, but do you feel that Pathfinder would benefit from having legendary actions, or does it mess around with the balancing too much?
So I think that Pathfinder doesn't need to have legendary actions due to the fact that it has enough tech to just do that. All you have to do is give it a reaction that is at the end of an opponent's turn, or a free action that's at the end of the opponent's turn with a certain frequency, and that just does the same thing as legendary actions. Now, there is something that 5e has that Pathfinder also has, but I think it's harder to judge it in Pathfinder, even though the Pathfinder version is possibly more expressive. And this is something that the Dr. Droland's creatures, I think, for the most part, don't have, but I do want to talk about in converting, which is layer actions. So Pathfinder 2e absolutely has the potential to do anything you would need from a layer action, because of the fact that it has complex hazards, which are basically traps or other hazards that roll into initiative right alongside your creatures, and they do their thing every turn. And many layer actions could be best converted by turning them into a complex hazard. Some could become a creature's ability if they were really more about the creature in the layer more than about the layer itself. It depends on the situation. One thing I do like about explicitly calling them layer actions and putting them in the creature like 5e does it, is that it kind of forces it to the GM's forefront and makes them, I think, more likely to use it. Whereas Pathfinder absolutely can do it. It's even more expressive when you can build a complex hazard. And the Game Master Guide even suggests multiple times, hey, consider adding complex hazards. But in the end of the day, the GM just might not do it anyway. Whereas by calling it a layer action and then putting it directly in the creatures, just the way that is phrased and framed makes it more likely that the GM will have to confront it because it's there in front of them in the creature. So that's one where I think that the framing could potentially was actually very nice and useful in 5e, whereas a lot of times I tend to like the Pathfinder 2 framing. I am biased because I co-created Pathfinder 2, so I had a say on the framing for certain things.
You biased? What?
So,
but I do like the way that those kinds of reactions that trigger to the end of a turn can play with it. It definitely made me think more about how can I use that in my own design later, because it's a versatile trigger that I hadn't really thought much about.
There's always something good to be found in the design of other role-playing games, which is one reason why, if you check back on the channel and you're watching this, there's a whole episode we have about a year back that's like, Steven named it something like quit playing D&D for now in order to get better at playing D&D. And it was about like, it was like, a kind of spicy name for it, but it was more about like, if you switch to another system for a little bit, you might find something really cool that you can bring back to your favorite system. And I think that's definitely the case. So if we think of anything else for monsters, we can come back to it. But I want to talk about some other kinds of conversions. We briefly went into adventures. But player-facing rules are also often something that people wind up coming into question for conversions. And before we get into any examples from Dr. Droland's Dictionary of Dinosaurs, one of the first places people sometimes come into this is if they're like, okay, my group wants to move to Pathfinder 2. I've been convinced. I looked at some of these videos. It seems like it's more up our alley. But we're in the middle of a campaign, and this person's got a warlock, and that person has a bard of this specific college, and like, how would I do that? And a lot of times people say, well, maybe actually finish your 5e campaign or start a new campaign. But the second piece of advice people give is be willing to reimagine them. You need to be willing to not say that they have to be literally called the same class that they were before, even if that class exists in Pathfinder. It's possible that your like heavy aggro paladin who went in 5e, who goes into a furious rant every time that they say evil and deal massive damage to them, and would never defend anyone even if their life depended on it, might be expressed by a different class than the champion class and the paladin style character in Pathfinder 2, which is very much a defender that wants to protect the weak. And maybe you're like a barbarian who, like, your instinct is that you hate evil, or you're some other class than that. You need to be willing to look into that when you're converting a player character directly. And in the same vein of kind of looking at the concept, the core of the character, and the feeling, that is also true when you're converting player-based mechanics, because sometimes you might need to convert something that is meant for players into a different type of mechanic entirely than what it was before. I'm guessing there could have been some examples of that in this conversion project as well. Linda, what is something good in the like player-facing rules to talk about?
I think that the ancestries are the part of the player-facing rules that I've spent the most time on. This book has 6 different ancestries that are very very distinctive from each other, and I guess when you were kind of coming up with the framework for these ancestries, how much of it was about like, these are like biological features that came from that dinosaur, and how much of it was like, here's like a cool culture that might either play to themes or surprise people in some way? Like, how did you come up with those concepts?
Yeah, so a bit of both is the answer. It's a good split. So the first thing we did was we decided on the sort of species that we were wanting to bring into as playable species and ancestries. then I worked with Mark Whitten, who was our illustrator, he's also a doctor of paleontology, and he's a phenomenal artist, one of the world's best paleo artists. And we actually sat down together, and we spent a few nights talking about each of these species designs, and we worked using functional anatomy to actually design them as though, okay, let's take these animals and let's make them more humanoid. How does that work? How what does their body do? And the really interesting thing is that when you talk about dinosaurs, was there's actually animals that are alive today that have fulfilled that. And for dinosaurs, the obvious answer is penguins. They're now bipedal and they walk upright. But you don't want to be making penguin characters, so we did have to put a bit of a fantasy flair on them a little bit, and anthropomorphize them more than we would if they were direct. This is what this animal does if it evolves tool making, and if it evolves bipedality, if it's not already. But some of the really interesting stuff is in like the shape of spines of dinosaurs. So the many-horn, which are our triceratops, well, they're various ceratopsians, but most people go with triceratops. Their spines curve outwards the whole way down, which is not something you get in humans, and that's because they're fundamentally different in their spine structure. Dinosaurs are than mammals. But we took these kind of designs. We got the base morphology of these different species down, and then we were like, right, almost every setting has dinosaur folk as like Aztec themed, like lizard men, Warhammer Fantasy-esque, jungle dwelling, temple city people. And we were like, right, we want to take that and we want to throw it away. We want to come up with stuff that's new, or come up with stuff that's at least distinct from that. So we tried to come to design societies that we felt were very, very different from that, but still recognizable as societies. And so we went into history a bit, and we looked at ancient Greek and sort of some older English societies as well. But we didn't want to do direct ports, because it's too, it can cause problems, and also if it's really obvious, then it's kind of like oh, okay, it's just this. So we took a core from different peoples in history, and then we really stripped that all away, and we said, okay, well, what aspect of the aesthetic are we keeping? What are we changing about their history? And we totally rebuilt everything basically. But you might notice on some of them it's like, okay, well, this is a almost Greek robe inspired, but their society is like totally different. And the only one that we really stuck to was the Pluven, which is our raptor folk. And we were like, they're going to be oldie English. We want them to be, they're based on sort of rural Cornwall, which is sort of where my in-laws are. So we were like, right, we're just gonna port that directly over and set it back a few hundred years and do that. But yeah, we really did use genuinely a mix of science and just like wild creativity to come up with them.
Yeah, and there is so much fun to read through too, and then to look at. So when doing it as an ancestry in Pathfinder, a 5e species is going to have a lot of abilities that it says, okay, the species does a lot of the heavy lifting. It has a lot of abilities in it. Whereas in Pathfinder, you're going to have the species gives sort of only the bare basics. Then you have a heritage that gives something else that's generally biologically based, that's distinctive about your character based on their environment and their physiology. And then you have a bunch of feats that represent how they, maybe how they train, how they specialize. It could represent upgrading some of their physiological abilities too. So that when looking at it, I was thinking, okay, for which of these ancestries is it very important that everyone has that sort of natural attack type thing versus it being a thing that you can choose to focus in? So then you have something like the many horn, and it's like horn is in their name. You know what? Like if you're a many horn, you know, by default you are going to have a horn. But then there was some cool information you had in there about how you know, there are some many horn that are actually descended from Protoceratops that they have you know, they don't have that horn. So then for heritage, then that lets me say, okay, you know, you're descended from Protoceratops. You don't have a horn, but you know, your beak is more pronounced and you can use your beak in fighting instead. So then you kind of have that, like, the horn is the default, but you can switch it out. So for a lot of the other ancestries, then it's like, okay, you know, for the Pluven, are you going to focus on, you know, your claws and your fighting stuff, or are you more interested in, like, you know, being someone who's handy and good at climbing and fixing your cottage and things like that, you know, so you can decide what you want to focus on. And in 5e, you know, it does have that sort of concept where there's a sense of, okay, your PCs, you can be exceptional, you don't have to have these abilities, you can take feats, but this kind of lets you say, what do I want to focus on for the heritage? And another thing that I wanted to do, since some of these attacks then were based on physical features, and people might say, okay, but like, I want to, maybe I didn't want to choose the heritage about my claws to start with, but now I want to start fighting with my claws to give like feats and such for be able to unlock, okay, you've practiced with your claws, now you can attack with your claws. But then like the person who started off with that can get better on it.
So Linda, when you were converting, you said that you were able to start with the 5e species that has slightly more into it than the very base of an ancestry. But Pathfinder ancestries are usually at minimum 4 pages, and those are bare bones, and they do not have enough feats. I know, because I had to write them at 4 pages, and I asked for more space every time. Sometimes I was given more space at first, only to have the space be like, wait a minute, we won't be able to fit enough, we're gonna have to take the space back. 6 pages or more ideally, which is just longer, and it has, clearly there's more content and there's feats and other things that go significantly beyond just converting the other base abilities of a species into an ancestry. So if someone is out there and they are trying to convert like their favorite thing, like maybe a turtle or something like that from 5e, and they want to do it in Pathfinder, what techniques would you suggest for being inspired to creating those ancestry feats to fill out those niches and make an entire ancestry out of it?
One of the things that I've been looking at here a lot is the story of the ancestries. Like there's the many horn have this have a very important in their society, a guild structure. So then I'm gonna flesh out that and say, okay, you know, what could be the mechanical benefits of working with these guilds, or what happens if you don't have a guild? What could be a way to mechanically represent that? You know, what parts of the story seem like they could translate to some benefit for characters who focus on being affiliated with, not affiliated with, good at, or ignoring a certain aspect that might be common with the culture of that ancestry. Another thing that I look at is things like what ancestries might have similar features and how might they have represented sort of those ideas. So like, for example, there's an ancestry in here that that has an idea of like, you know, a long memory, and they live a long time. So then I might also be looking to like, okay, well, you know, in Pathfinder, elves also have a long memory and have a long time that they live and pick up a lot of skills. So like I can see what might some of those feats have been, and how could I use that? Because ancestries in Pathfinder then do also sometimes share feats with each other when they work just as well for them. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel when the exact thing you were looking for already exists, but you also want to make sure that you have plenty of content that's something that's new and fresh and specific to that ancestry. And there are certain things that are chains that you might come to expect, like, you know, if you and you can look at other ancestries that have similar abilities for inspiration on that. So, you know, if you have an ancestry that has some kind of I have an unarmed attack that I do then I'm probably going to have something around 5th level that does something with critical specialization, or something around 9th level that does something with, doing some extra bleed damage or some other type of damage on my critical hits or things like that. So you can look for things that have similar themes and what types of ways that they upgrade those themes. And even if you're not like, oh, I'm not doing the same type of damage, but it's the same general idea of this is an appropriate level to have an ability that does extra damage on a critical for a creature that's themed like this. And then you can also think about, like, is my character more that thing or less that thing than the example I'm looking at? So, for the ancestry that's flying, they're pterosaur ancestry, so flying is a really big deal for them. So then when looking at how quickly they can get flying, I'm going to say, okay, that's the fastest speed that flying will appear in an ancestry. It's not the slower speed, because it's like really important for them. Whereas if there was an ancestry that was like, maybe I can eventually get flying or climbing or whatever, but it's not a really big deal, then that might be a little more delayed. Or like, I mean, a lot of ancestries in Pathfinder also have feats that are related to, what kind of ties they might have to magic or magic spells. So that's a good thing to look at too, for things to add. Do they have some kind of innate magic to them?
That makes sense. So let's take a look at another type of content that I know a lot of people mentioned being interested in when they heard about this Kickstarter. It's one that people don't think about converting very often, but they can actually have a big impact on your game. And just because I think a lot of books don't have a lot of these, and that's the creature adjustments. They were called templates in 3.5 in Pathfinder First Edition. They're called adjustments in Pathfinder 2. So, if I recall correctly, I knew there were some of these in this book, so I asked on a Reddit thread and was surprised to find out there were like 110 or some very high number of creature adjustments that
120.
are 120
yep.
creature adjustments that are in this book that you can apply, like, instead of the typical elite adjustment in Pathfinder 2 to bump something up a level, you can use one of these 70 bespoke bumping up a level adjustments. Linda, how did you convert that more from 5e, where things in monster creation are like a little looser and just some of those abilities could kind of just be thrown in there, into Pathfinder 2, where you want to make sure that the monsters are like very accurately in the framework for their level?
So the guidance in the 5e book, it has minor mutations, and then it also has major mutations. And the guidance is that the minor mutations might increase the CR by 0 or 1/2 or 1, or maybe decrease the CR by 1, and the major ones might increase it by 2 to 3. So then I was thinking, okay, well, for Pathfinder, I'm definitely going to need to break this out into exactly how much they're changing the level. So I was thinking, okay, majors, I can set them all so that they're a power level that's an increase of 2. And then for the minors, I'm breaking it out into a few different sections. So I've got those 4 that, so that can be a nice little D4 of the ones that are level -1. Then there were 20 that I felt like their impact is small enough that making it level +0 is okay, because it's more like, oh, I'm a wader, I can wade in shallow water. That doesn't really make them that much harder. Whereas things that are going to increase offensive or defensive power in a significant way, you're going to want to see that accompanied by, in Pathfinder, by an increase to the statistics that balances that out. So, for example, if you have an ability that grants a defensive increase in some way, then you're not going to want to give it the full adjustment that the elite adjustment would give. You're not going to want to give it, +2 to its AC and +20 hit points or whatever, because it got some of that from other parts of the defense that it has. Or if it has something that is more offensive, maybe it's not going to get the full attack bonus and damage bonus from that. So the way that I'm conceptualizing this is by considering sort of what bucket these abilities fit into, and then adjusting the amount of benefit that you gain relative to the elite adjustment in that way. So, a creature that can hold its breath for up to an hour, that's something I don't need to worry about. Okay, that's going to really impact the level or something like that. But if a creature gains a reaction to splurt toxic secretions all over somebody, that is something that increases its power. So, but like, it's not necessarily increasing its defenses, but it does increase its offenses. So then I would kind of consider what I'm gonna increase to go along with it. So it'd say like, okay, increase the AC and these things by this amount. Or if a creature, if a creature gains some intelligence, then maybe it's gonna get some extra skills, but it's not necessarily gonna get more ferocious in other ways. So it just depends on what you're doing and how to make that feel like it's a fair adjustment for +1 level. Because in general, like the elite adjustment giving a +2 to a lot of things is accounting for the fact that when you're using a simple adjustment like that, you're not giving the creature additional abilities like you might expect of something higher level. So if you are giving it additional abilities, then you don't necessarily need to increase the stats by as much. I know there was a chat online where people were talking about, what if I created a level 110? What was it that you created a level 110?
Somebody in Discord, when they found out there were this many adjustments, they determined that if they applied all the minuses, the 4 minuses, all the zeros, all the ones, and all the twos onto a badger, it would be like a level 117 badger. And then Linda, you said that you thought that badger would not be strong enough compared to other level 117 creatures. As if those existed.
Yes. Well, the problem is that it's going to have like 10 different reactions it can do, but you don't want to design something with 10 different reactions, right? You want to have things that aren't competing with each other.
Didn't you say it would also be smaller and larger than average?
It would be both. It would both be smaller and larger than typical creatures of its size. It would both have thin skin that is easily cut and thick osteoderms that are nearly impenetrable. It just would not remotely make sense.
So to just provide a bit of context to our viewers about the table. So we created, and this is something that Michael was really proud of in the book, and that I agree with him. It's got so much applicability beyond dinosaurs and beyond what we do here. But we created a D100 table for minor mutations and a D20 table for major mutations, and the idea behind this was that basically I got kind of sick as a DM of picking an environment that my players are walking through and then looking at the creatures that would be suitable for that environment and thinking it's the same 6 or 10 things over and over again. Once you've run it a few times, if you've got your players in a swamp for 2 months, they're only going to meet the same things over and over and over again. So how do we make it so that any of our creatures here and any other creatures can be adapted to new environments? So within the book, we also have a environmental icon system where we represent each of our Mesozoic reptiles. We've included icons that represent different environments that we believe that animal would have inhabited, so that you can take any Mesozoic reptile and put it. You say you've got a tundra or a snowy mountain environment. You can take a bunch of them. You go, okay, well, actually, these ones would all go there. If you're ignoring time periods and all that sort of stuff. But we expanded on that with the mutation table, and we were like, okay, let's provide adaptations for creatures to allow them to be in those environments specifically. So you can take a wolf and you could give it adaptations for an island environment, and it's like, okay, this is a wolf. Oh, I've encountered a wolf on an island, but it's noticeably different. It's noticeably changed for that environment. Or so you could apply it to anything. We didn't give environmental icons to every mutation because we were ambitious with a D100. I just love D100 tables. It's just my preference. But we wanted to try and make everything in the table be a real adaptation. There's a couple of it's got a mana gland and it can cast magic missile sort of thing. But the vast majority of it are real adaptations based on real biology. The major mutation table is slightly different because it's draconic ancestry and that sort of stuff, but flight and things like that. So the idea was that it allows much more customization. And then when we brought it in, we designed it, brought it into 5e, and tried to balance it, it was just immediately obvious that it was like, unless you're doing a breakdown by breakdown of individual mutations, even then it was really like difficult to balance. We couldn't really do it because a CR10 creature with a slight change here is very different in power compared to a CR1 that's got the same change. So we kind of were like, well, you know, if you're going to use this, you might have to be a bit savvy with your balancing, but obviously that doesn't carry as easily to Pathfinder because it's so much more mechanically tight. And so I think like Linda's approach to it is really, really solid, having some be an upgrade, some be a side grade, and some be a downgrade. Was basically what we intended, and I'm really, really pleased to see that it's porting well, because honestly this was the part of the book that I thought that would be by far the most challenging. Do you think that it's been the most challenging part of it, or has it just been uh the most fun, or one or the other?
I mean, I think that so. I still have plenty of work to do on it, but I did do the initial sort of sorting of deciding of how I would do things, and sorting everything into its categories of which one's going to go where and things like that. So I'll still have some decisions to make, but I know broadly how I'm going to do that. I would say that, you know, that this probably will be the most challenging section ultimately. But that's mainly, I think, because you gave me such good information to work with in terms of both the actual science for the dinosaurs as well, and other Mesozoic reptiles, as well as in the ancestries for what is their story. That I have a lot to grab onto there. So the fact that this is mechanically a little different then makes it more challenging. But this project has really been so much fun to work on. So
That's
I
good to hear.
suspected it would be really tricky as well. That's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it, because it brings up another tip that you can sort of see from what Linda was doing here. And unfortunately, this is a tip that not everyone who's here might be able to use, because it's one that comes from foreign language translation as well in some ways. When you're translating between two languages, and you have someone who is, you know, they know both of the languages, but one of the languages, it's just like that's their native language. They use it all the time. They may even like have like a degree in it and know tons of things about it. Which one do you want? Do you want the source language, or do you want the destination language? And the answer is, in translation, you want the destination language. You want someone who's from the language you're translating into, if you have to pick, even if they're a little weaker at the one you're translating out of, because your final work, your final piece, is going to be something that is viewed and seen by people in the destination language. And so my tip for you, if you're converting between two RPGs, between 5e and Pathfinder 2, is you want to find someone like Linda, if it's Pathfinder 2, or who's more an expert in 5e if you're going in the other way, who is very, very strong in the destination system, because they're going to be able to find things like what Linda did there, where she's like, okay, I see this overwhelming list of hundreds of things that all could be something, and then find things that are from Pathfinder 2 that are similar, like the elite adjustment, and say, what can I change there? And then Linda gave the examples of, well, if it gives heavy plating, maybe I would give less of a defensive boost than the elite adjustment normally does, but still give some of the same offensive boost plus the plating. And so being able to understand the system, know where everything goes, know what everything is, and then plug in something new to it without reinventing the wheel and without bringing in something that doesn't fit, is going to create something for you that is seamless, in just the same way as a foreign language translation. So my piece of advice is, if you are converting between two systems and you're the expert in the first system that is the source, possibly because you wrote that one, find someone who's an expert in the destination system. Now, if you're converting because you love Pathfinder 2 and you know it a lot, and you just bought something from 5e because it looked great, you are the expert in Pathfinder 2 for your group, so you can use this technique. And in that case, I suggest use your knowledge carefully and think about what is similar. It might not be the thing on the surface that seems that way. So for the next thing to talk about, I want to talk about magic items because they're a little tricky too. In 5e, it's kind of well known that the books claim that it's all based around not getting magic items and that magic items are just extras, but like nobody runs it without giving out magic items. The magic items are definitely, maybe you're watching this, you're like, Mark, I do. I never give out magic items in 5e, but I think that like 99% or more of games give out a fair number of magic items. And it's always good to have more because of that, even in 5e. But because they are like, this is kind of just a thing, and we don't have a set price, it could be anywhere between this amount and 10 times that amount in this band if it's a rare item. It's definitely a lot less scientific than the values and for the magic items that like I wrote up for Pathfinder 2. And so I guess I want to talk about converting items a little bit because that can be one that's tricky. You don't have somewhere to work with. Like with a monster, at least you see, oh, that monster was level 10 or CR 10. Maybe I'll make it level 10. With the items, like at best you'll have like this D&D item is rare. Okay. And there is sort of a level range that you can find. Like it's like a level range of a few levels-ish when you start finding those items in D&D, kind of, that you can convert them into. But how would you go about, Linda, how did you go about like looking at an item from 5e and then turning it into a Pathfinder 2 item?
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm looking at with the magic items is what is the thing that the item is trying to achieve, and when might that type of effect generally come online in Pathfinder? When might you start to be able to do that kind of thing? For a sense of fairness with it. And also, I'll be taking a look at things like, does this thing, if you have like a specific weapon, for example, how powerful does this specific weapon power feel? Does it feel like it's, 1 rune's worth of ability? And so, maybe that's going to be more like something that's going to be on a +1 striking weapon or something like that. Or does it feel like it's multiple runes worth of abilities, and then so you're going to need a greater strike, +2 greater striking weapon or something like that to be able to hold that kind of power budget. So those sorts of things for a starting place, or like if you have something and it wants to give you a bonus on like a certain type of check, then I might consider, okay, does this thematically feel like something that should be giving should be like here's my starter +1 item bonus item that has kind of like a little cool ribbon that's with it, or like this is my legendary staff of this kind of thing that's giving me all of these kinds of benefits. So
absolutely,
I would say that it's going to be more a matter of feel than trying to be like directly, in D&D you wouldn't have gotten this item until this level.
And one thing that I when I was converting items between the two found is that I sometimes wanted to create multiple versions of an item where I was like, this seems cool and people might want to keep using it at higher levels, but like it never scales up because in 5e it usually doesn't, whereas like I'd be like, okay, maybe there's a greater version of this that does scale up and could become more powerful than the original version. So that's something that you should be on the lookout to add in if you are converting a 5e item and you think this is cool, this is a cool weapon. Well, if it's a specific weapon and you want the PCs to keep using it at much higher levels, you might want to like have an upgraded version that they can like graduate into and be like, oh yeah, now it's gotten even stronger, just like I have. You can always upgrade the runes and add striking and more pluses, but if it had a mild special effect on top of that only, then by higher levels you would have been better off by just getting like a bunch of generic runes on there instead.
Yeah, so can you make that into like a greater version in some way?
Right.
And I think sorry to jump in. I think it's worth noting. Maybe this is me being a cruel GM, but I think items are relatively forgiving in designing them because they don't have to always be available, and they are something that can be taken away if they end up being a problem. It's not like an ancestry where if once the player's picked it, that's what they are. Once they've picked that feat, that's what they've picked. An item can be pinched by an assassin, or it can be swallowed by a creature. There are mechanical, and role playing ways you can remove them if you're playtesting something with a group of friends and you found that it's not really working, or you've given someone an item and they find it's underwhelming. Well, the next merchant that comes along might have the greater version.
Yeah. I would say my personal advice, if you're playtesting something and you're not sure, is let people know in advance, just so that they know. And then that way you can work together with them and be like, look, we were playtesting it. I think we both seen that it's doing too much. So do you think we should adjust it down, change it to something else? Or would it make more sense in narrative if we just say it got eaten by a Spinosaurus? And get them on board rather than just, I would say, unilaterally have a Spinosaurus eat it, because players really don't like having their items taken away. They, in many cases, rather die than lose their favorite items. I mean, not in real life. I mean, their characters.
No, but
die.
like characters, like absolutely, it's hilarious how attached people can get to their items sometimes. Yeah, I can also see stories about like you were saying about getting the higher level version or getting some kind of like a magical technique that's going to let you upgrade it, or maybe like it by virtue of performing the great deed of slaying this dangerous monster, then your item upgrades in some certain type of way.
Yeah, sorry, I should have clarified. You're absolutely right, Mark. It's always that's for in-game purposes, but in terms of actual playtesting, playing with your friends, always have that conversation. You don't want to be having a very upset player because you've pinched their favorite part of the game.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right, though, that if you do that to someone's ancestry or class, it hurts even more than anything
Yeah,
else, because
absolutely.
those become part of their character's identity, and a character is a tiny piece of a person's identity, even though they're a make-believe character. And so when you come after their class or their ancestry in a way that is not true for items, even if it's an errata or an adjustment in power level, it can feel more personal, and it can cause like grief, like actual grief, in the changes with all of the stages, like denial and anger and bargaining and all of those kinds of things. So you sometimes want to be careful with those conversations, and if you've preloaded in advance that I'm testing it out, we might change it, it's a lot better than if it's sort of they feel like it was something stable that they could work on and build on, and then that kind of crumbles beneath them.
Mark, you've done a lot. I know you've done a lot of reading of playtests and errata feedback and threads and seeing what people say and like how attached they get to certain things. So
Yes, I have. And I'm trying to say this in a sense, I'm not belittling the responses that people have here, and I'm not trying to belittle other people's grief by comparing it to the grief that people have when their favorite features are like changed in a way that makes them weaker or removed, because these are real responses that people have, and they may be of different magnitudes, but that doesn't make them less genuine. So I want to do another player focused one here, and this one's a little more tricky sometimes, because you have to decide what to convert something into, which is the ground between feats, subclasses, and archetypes. And I'm in archetypes being only in Pathfinder 2, of course, whereas subclasses in 5e are sometimes called class paths in Pathfinder 2, but that type of thing sort of does exist in both games. Obviously, feats exist in both games, but in different ways. But when you see something in one of the two systems, let's say 5e, we're mostly talking about converting that to Pathfinder 2. When you see a feat or you see a subclass, how would you decide to keep that as a feat, what category to put that feat in, or to make it into an archetype. Same with subclass. Keep it as a subclass, make it into an archetype, make it into a feat. What do you think, Linda?
Yeah, so when I was looking through here, it really depended upon the nature of the nature of the feature and how much did it feel like it was tied to something that existed in a similar way in Pathfinder. So for the Druid circle that's in here, it's like, okay, well, this is very much intended to be, this is a type of Druid that you can be. Pathfinder has Druid orders. I can totally make it that, because it's very specifically like, you are a Druid and. Whereas there is a subclass here for Artificer, which is a class that doesn't exist. So in Pathfinder, so obviously I can't do that as a subclass.
I mean,
right?
you could have found a class to make it a subclass of.
Yeah, but like I felt like it was such a cool idea that the thing about archetypes is that because you can take them on any class, they're more flexible. And so I really wanted, instead of trying to like force it into the theme of one exact class, to be like, okay, yeah, anybody could take this.
That makes sense. Can we use both the Druid order and then the Artificer subclass as two separate examples of going in opposite ways so that people can get a sense of when you would do that? And if so, I'd like to start with having Nathan describe what these were and what like the idea and concept behind them were in 5e, and then Linda describe sort of how she decided to make it either still be a subclass or not, starting with the Druid circle. What do you guys think?
Yeah, sure. So the Druid is the Circle of Cycles Druid, and we wanted to come up with basically a deep time Druid. When we first mentioned that we were going to be doing a Druid subclass, everyone was like, dinosaur shapeshifter, dinosaur shapeshifter, dinosaur shapeshifter. But the thing is the Moon Druid is so good, and so many people use it, and that's already going to be basically compatible with the book as is. So we thought, right, well, let's do something that's quite different. So the Circle of Cycles Druid is all about deep time. We wanted essentially a Druid of geology. Okay, so they functionally kind of work like they're a Druid / divination wizard, in that they're all about predicting the future based on knowledge of the past, or gaining knowledge from deep time, either in the past or future, and also kind of like reshaping themselves a little bit so they can change how old they appear. They can hibernate for eons. Like, so in terms of how that, I can see that being potentially, interesting in a campaign if the rest of the party dies off and you're just, oh, I'm just going to hibernate for 2 million years and see what happens. But we'll see. But it's been received quite well. People like it. It's been described as trippy is the best way to describe it, I think. It's a bit more esoteric than other Druid subclasses, because it's dealing with concepts that are a little strange. So, and you're dealing with time frames that most people can't wrap their heads around. I mean, I definitely can't. When you're talking about millions of years. Not that you have to have millions of years be in your campaign, mind you. But yeah, that's the Druid. The Bone Sculptor is an Artificer subclass, and it's my favorite. I will unabashedly say that. I wanted to have an Artificer that basically utilized corpses, right? And that the idea is that rather than making armor and weapons out of metal and wood and other materials, you just use the slain creatures in front of you. It's got kind of almost a Monster Hunter aesthetic, but a lot darker. It's a lot more grisly. We wanted it to be like, okay, well, you can essentially create loads of items, but it's also like primarily a pet subclass. So you get the Construct of Flesh, which is a companion that's really very, very customizable and quite powerful. Mostly because I played an Artificer for quite a long time, and the Battlesmith, just kind of the companion really sucked. It was really quite boring. So I wanted to make one that was much more dynamic. I ended up playing an Armorer specifically because the other subclass was not to my liking. So designing this one was like, it was quite cathartic to be able to say, right, this is what I wanted when I played Artificer for years. So yeah, it's we got some fun ideas into it. Like we really like the idea of having your weapons be part of you, so you can have like those kind of Wolverine moments where like blades slick out from your hand and stuff. It's kind of gross, but also really good fun. Um, and I imagine as an archetype and as there being no like Artificer, it must be really challenging finding a way to get that to work in Pathfinder. Um, but also, this is going to go into probably a bit too much detail, but because of the original OGL license, Artificer wasn't covered, right? So we originally did design it as almost a class agnostic subclass, but with the strong suggestion that it was going to be for Artificer, and that's why it denotes that it's Artificer compatible. And the wording's slightly different, and it doesn't mention infusions or anything like that in the actual the subclass itself. But then obviously all the OGL drama happened, and then we have the Creative Commons, and now we can say, okay, well, it's an Artificer compatible class, and that's fine. So yeah. Anyway, there's a bit more detail than we needed there, but I'll let you crack on.
Hey, you know what? That can all of these small factors sometimes about licenses can make a big impact.
Yeah.
And before we get into what Linda actually did, like for instance, if the orc license didn't come about for the same reason that Paizo moved from OGL, like Linda might have had an option to create an inventor subclass that invented based on that, or maybe a thaumaturge or some other class that isn't in the orc. So it does have an impact every time you're doing things. But let's dig in then to the two separate examples. We've got this like Eon Druid of cycles, and we've got this like bone crafting Artificer. So Linda, how did you come up with your decisions to make one of them continue to be a class path and make the other into an archetype?
Well, first I want to say that absolutely, if Inventor was available, I would have made this an Inventor path, because then I could have built off of the tech that Inventor already has for having companions and things like that. And then because when you can build off existing tech, then you can save a lot of space for putting in more content. But in this case, because it wasn't available, and I'm just looking at what's in player core for this, it was like, all right, well, I think this is going to go best as being something that is going to be flexible, rather than trying to shoehorn it in and be like, this is a I don't know, like, what is it, a variant alchemist at that point? But like, it really didn't. But that would come with a lot of baggage that it wouldn't necessarily have, you know. So I figured that because there wasn't something that was available to me that it fit well with, and also because it's something that is like just like how you can have other archetypes, like you have like the Beastmaster archetype, and you're like, okay, I just want to be any character and I want to have an animal companion. I was thinking it could be kind of more like that, is like, this is a character that gives you a companion no matter who you are. You can add this into your story. You can be someone who's more of like the intellectual who's focused on these kinds of like crafting as well as you can, and standing back and things like that. Or you could be someone who is more focused on this like, go my minion, or someone who's more focused on like getting in there and smashing, and those would be different paths that you could take. Now I do want to caveat that these are while I've done a fair bit of work on some of the other sections of the book, this is something that I'm just in the brainstorming and planning stage here. So it's entirely possible that some of the things I'm saying might change as I actually crack into the meat of it and start working on it. But that's what some of my initial thoughts are. And then for the druid. For the druid circle, which is then an order, then thinking about like, okay, what am I going to do for like the order specific, this has a specific spell in here that it gives, and it's like, oh, okay, well, that's kind of like the order spell for a druid order. So like, how can that sort of fit right in?
Right, because orders, you need like a skill, a
Mm-hmm.
spell, an
And a feat, yeah.
anathema, and then several, like a fairly good number of feats that you
Feats,
can
yes, you
eventually
need
take.
feats. So then that's going to be sort of what the translation is like, here's the spell that they all have, and then like here's the feats that you can take to build it, and here's the, and I think that it's going to be pretty natural to convert that over. There's certain things that don't necessarily port exactly just because of the differences, but that general theme of like, here's what they all have, and then here's what you can customize into,
Right.
just fine.
And just from Nathan's description, it feels to me like an anathema of like, make a hot-headed, short-sighted decision instead of looking over the scope of the long term could be like something that the Druid Order tells people not to do, or something. There's, I'm sure, tons of lore that's in there that can be used to come up with something like that.
Absolutely.
It's going to be really interesting to see what you do with the spell. So for those who haven't seen the book, we gave the druid a spell called Evolution Devolution, which is the idea is it's a touch spell, and you draw out a trait for that creature that it had in its past or it might have in its future, or you can withdraw a trait that it has. So the really crazy thing about it, and what is too strong really for 5e, but and I'm sure won't work well with Pathfinder and will need serious consideration, is that you can do things like remove a creature's ability to fly. So if you're on the back of a dragon and you're being carried away and your circle of cycles goes, well, this dragon's just going to devolve so it can't fly anymore, and then you just all plummet. That's like the most wild extreme version of it. Obviously the dragon has to fail the save and not have any legendary resistances and what have you, but it's going to be really interesting to see what of that we can keep, but also within the realms of sensibleness. I feel like Pathfinder in general is a lot more sensible than 5e.
Well, here's my prognostication, given Linda said she hasn't converted it yet, and I have not seen exactly what it says in 5e. This is my guess. So, you will be creating a focus spell for the order, and it's going to start at first level, and first spell rank that they're going to have this. So, what my prediction is that they, like the Evolution Surge focus spell for the Summoner, there might be a menu of possible things that you can add or remove. And when you heighten the focus spell, that's when you're going to get flight and certain other options. At a point where the Earthbind spell already is a third rank spell in Pathfinder that can force a flying creature to the ground and possibly ban it from flying depending on its save for a certain amount of time. And that one has a range that is not touch. And it's third rank. So if you actually have to go up and touch the flying creature, you've already done half the work at that point. So presumably, at whatever rank that I can't remember, even though I wrote the Evolution Surge for Summoner, but whatever rank I gave them flying on the Evolution Surge, I'm sure it's reasonable to remove flying from a creature, especially if you could already go ahead and touch it.
Yeah.
And so that's my guess is that you will find that it is able to keep those features by using the robust heightening system, which 5e has heightening as well, but focus spells auto heighten, and so that means that it'll just get more powerful alongside your druid.
Yeah, so like for example, it says here this one already has like a higher level, so when you cast it using a slot of third level or higher, you can do 2 of these things. So I suspect this will probably wind up being something where it's like once it's heightened to a certain level, then you can do one of these things, or maybe it'll let you do 2 of the weaker things or 1 of the stronger things or something like that. I've certainly designed content that's like that, where it puts things into buckets of like, these are major changes, moderate changes, minor changes, that sort of thing.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing it.
So I think that was an especially good example because it hasn't been converted yet. So we're having the kinds of discussions out loud here on the stream that you at home, when you're doing your conversion, will have to think about. Maybe find a buddy that you can talk to them. Or if not, you can just talk to a goldfish or a What's the other expression for the thing that you just talked to, like a potato or something like that, when you're
Oh, no.
coding and you're trying to talk it out in programming? You can always talk to the wall and try to like think about the pros and cons, the different ways you might do things, and just the way that we did here. I think that that's pushing towards a solution to this problem. Rubber ducking, Juho said, that's right. Rubber duck is another example of something that you can talk to. So get your rubber duck out of the bath, and you can use that as well. If you don't have a friend who you can talk to about these kind of things. Sometimes when you don't bounce it off back and forth, you might get like kind of narrowed down into your own path of thinking and not realize that there was an outside the box solution for the conversion that would have worked better than because this is once again tied to that number one mistake of doing a direct conversion. But even when you're doing it indirectly, you might have this first idea of like, well, I have to convert it this way, and then you realize you could convert it a completely different way, and everything falls into place if you do, and suddenly what seemed like it was an intractable problem is just a breeze once you kind of change your framework, which another person, maybe more so than a rubber duck, can help you find.
Yeah, and and I think one of the points that we've been circling around and alluded to several times is that sometimes there will be effects that are like completely normal and expected in one system for a given level, and another system like, oh my gosh, you can't do that at that level, but that's a higher level ability, but there'll be some different way to get that kind of concept across that isn't, quite as much. So like, maybe there's something that in one system could paralyze you, but like that's a little much in Pathfinder, so maybe it slows you. Or maybe like there's something that a lot of times in Pathfinder, abilities that really mess up the target are gonna only do that full thing if they critically fail, or have the incapacitation traits, so that like if the target is, so if you're using them against a more powerful target, they're not going to have a chance to get that critical failure, and they're going to do better overall. So like there can be ways to include some of those, like, oh my gosh, the target is completely messed up effects in there, but just they're like the weaker creature completely flubbed it version, and not the and Pathfinder in general also tends to, with the 4 degrees of success, operate in a way where a lot of effects have they critically failed their day, they're having a very, very bad day. They failed, the normal thing happens. They succeeded, little something happens, and they critically succeed, they laugh it off. So that's another thing to consider when converting abilities, that is to give them sort of that 4 tiers in a lot of cases. And it can just be like success, fail, but if you want to do something fancy with it, then there's a lot of space there.
I recommend using at least 3 of the degrees of success almost every time, if not all 4.
Yeah.
But then again, I'm a huge evangelist for the 4 degrees of success, and I would consider convincing the other designers that we should play test it at least, and that it might not be too complicated, it might be worth it, was probably one of my major accomplishments in terms of something I knew only I would have done, since I put a lot of things into the system, but I feel my fellow designers, if they had been working on the same thing I had, might have come up with similar decisions too. But that one I know, because everyone else was like, this seems good, but I don't know, it might be a lot of math. But let's try it. It's a play test, and it worked out great. All right.
Did we have any questions in the chat come in?
I have been looking, and we only had that one earlier on. But if anybody has any other questions for us about converting between D&D and Pathfinder, or concepting in the first place and then converting from your concept into one system and then into the second system, like we showed in the examples here, feel free to ask us now, because I think we're getting towards the end of our discussion here. We've covered a lot of the ground that we said that we wanted to cover at the beginning. I see in chat, Katrina, who asked the other question before, said this has been a great conversation, and wanted to thank you guys for coming on here to have this discussion.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, you're welcome. Let's see. I haven't seen any other questions yet. So I'm going to remind everyone that the Kickstarter for the Pathfinder 2 version of Dr. Droland's Dictionary of Dinosaurs, which we've been talking about as a case study for converting is live. I have just put the link in the chat again. You can check it out right now. That is the one that Linda is working on converting from Nathan as we speak. I mean, not literally now. I don't see her typing, but other than now. Oh, there is a question.
I mean,
there's a question for you, Linda, that says,
yes.
to clarify, when you convert creatures, did you assign level by abilities or ability by level or some of each? So if you saw a creature with a very ability that in Pathfinder would be very inappropriate for its level, even though it was appropriate in 5e, did you adjust the abilities to match the level more so, or did you adjust the level to match the abilities?
I adjusted the abilities to match the level because I knew there were other considerations at play, like how relatively powerful should the creature be compared to others. But if you are, but that doesn't mean that's what you should always do. If you are converting something over and it's entirely magical and fantastical, and you don't have like a specific level that you need to target for another reason, then sometimes you may want to go ahead and use the abilities first and then adjust it that way.
100%.
I mean, the real world is, even if you aren't creating something that has being scientifically accurate as a goal, the phenomenal biological diversity of the world is such a good source of inspiration for creature mechanics.
So I'll give, sort of try to congeal that down. Because Dr. Drollin's Dictionary of Dinosaurs had a high concept of being biologically accurate, it's very important to keep the relative levels of creatures more or less where they were, so that creatures that were said to be stronger dinosaurs still were. Whereas, let's say you were converting a Medusa and into another system, not Pathfinder 2, which already has a Medusa, and you discovered that a petrifying gaze was just absolutely inappropriate for whatever level it was at. Well, it's a Medusa, though, so it definitely needs to have a petrifying gaze. That's the most important. So you'd have to change the level. You'd be like, okay, I'll move it to higher level so it can have a petrifying gaze, even though in this system, only creatures of level 13 or higher have a petrifying gaze. This hypothetical system I'm making up. So, or you could be like, I'll do a petrifying gaze, but it slowly petrifies you over time, which is what the Pathfinder 2 Medusa does, instead of being like, oh, you're dead. You're a statue immediately, like in Pathfinder 1 and some other editions. So there are ways to go about it, depending on if your high concept is the ability, like with the Medusa, or if it is, I need a creature of this level, or if it's somewhere in between. There is a question about the Kickstarter. It says, are you expecting to put the PDF out in February, which was the delivery date listed in Kickstarter, or will the PDF be available earlier than that?
Yeah, so we've put February because obviously once the work's been done in terms of converting the actual rules, the book needs to be re-edited, and we won't know how much work that requires until we have the finished rule set. So we've put February as kind of a relatively conservative estimate. We're hoping it will be ready before, but we can't guarantee it. As with everything in Kickstarter, it's always you're moving through a bit of fog always. If we can get the PDF out beforehand, we will. We're aiming to print in early February, late January, and we'd much rather have the PDF out and everyone looking through it and spotting the little mistakes that we've missed, so that before we go to a print run, so that can be picked up on. But sometimes that's not always possible, but we will do our very, very best to achieve that.
Yeah, layout and copy fit on a 300 and some page book can take a while, and it's especially hellish when you have a Paizo or Roll for Combat style layout that has to fill the page and go to the bottom of every line. With Dr. Drollin's Dictionary of Dinosaurs, there's lots of really beautiful art, and then just like the text will go where it's going to go, which is a little looser. That should, I think, you'll take less time to have to handle it than with the equivalent with a Paizo or Roll for Combat layout, which is what I'm more used to having to copy fit. So at least that would be a plus side in that regard.
I think there's still going to be some challenges when it comes to things that require more words to express in Pathfinder than they do in D&D with respect to like adjusting the layout to fit the way that particular concepts are expressed. And that's probably going to be tricky, but I know you have great layout folks and the pages are very flexible. So I figure that most of it should fit, and if adjustments need to be made to make simpler, shorter versions of things to fit, then we can work that out.
I really should give a shout out to our editor as well, Ellie. She is seriously phenomenal in designing the layout. We're so happy to be working with her. She's really amazing.
So your editor is also sort of like the graphic designer for the layout who puts everything onto the page as well.
So sorry, I mean edit as in yeah, she does all of the graphic design rather the editing of the book rather than the editing of the text and the actual
got it.
stuff. Sorry,
Okay, yeah.
Terminology. But yeah, so she does like the copy proofing and moving the pictures and stuff, and yeah, she's really good. In terms of like the proofreading, we've got a quite a wide team that will be chipping in with that.
Awesome. Yeah, it's honestly the way that the titles are stated is different everywhere, but in tabletop RPGs, generally editing refers to text editing, even though like everything is really editing. Whereas you would use designer or in Paizo and maybe almost nowhere else, sometimes developer for like very specific game design related edits, which are also editing. And then for artistic and layout editings, you would list them as a layout credit or graphic design credit, usually in TTRPGs. But of course, that's different everywhere. And if you tell someone you're a Paizo developer, they all think that you do like the technical stuff that is like super nitty gritty, whereas that's more of a designer actually at Paizo. But because game developers, of course, are the ones who are going to go nitty gritty, hands deep into the code, whereas game designers in a video game are the ones who are doing the thing that's sort of like a more high up, designing the ideas for like what the adventure and scenario is, which would be a developer at Paizo, and it's all very confusing sometimes.
So I think your point is that nobody uses terminology in the same way.
Nobody
so
does, which is why I wanted to make sure to figure it out and explain it so everyone knows exactly what awesome work that the shout out is related to.
Speaking of awesome work, we have a question in chat for Nathan. Have you had any thoughts on a sequel, and what other areas of prehistory would you want to cover?
So the short answer is yes. A sequel is in the works. I will be cheeky. I'll let you know what the title is going to be. I actually announced it last weekend at Lyme Regis Fossil Festival to a small audience, but we'll put it on here as well so that it can't go back. It's going to be called Professor Primula's Portfolio of Paleontology, and it's basically going to be limited to nothing. So all paleontology. So if you want Cenozoic mammals, we're going to have some in there. If you want Paleozoic mollusks, we're going to have some in there. If you want fish, they're going to be in there. And obviously loads more dinosaurs, loads more interesting Permian animals, loads of stuff, as much as we possibly can. We'll see how that does. We will be bringing that to Kickstarter. And the plan is that we'll be doing that towards the end of this year. Whether or not we're able to achieve that or whether it will spill over into early next year, we're yet to see. We're still working on a few bits and bobs behind the scenes, but that's the plan. There is definitely another book in the works.
And if the Pathfinder 2 conversion Kickstarter does well enough for this one, would you be thinking of potentially doing that for the next one as well?
That's the plan. We are just trying to iron out the idea of if we want to do them as a combined Kickstarter from the get-go, or if we want to again do them separately and make sure we get the 5e design or just the D&D design done first, or if we want to do as you would recommend and go straight with the Pathfinder and then go backwards to D&D. We're still yet to figure out exactly the way we want to do it. But in terms of the list of animals and some of the 5e stat blocks are already well underway. Ancestry is well underway. The supplementary rules are well underway. So we've made pretty good progress so far. But yeah, we'll see where the future takes us.
That makes sense. I would say my generic advice of Pathfinder 2 to 5e bears out, but that's with some caveats, which is if your principal team is more experienced, then you want to write in the with 1 and it's 5e, you should write in 5e. If you're playtesters and your authors, just for the same reason that you hire a converter who knows the destination system, if you're experts in the paleontology who are also writing some of the rules, know 5e better, you should still do that. Plus, your 5e book already avoided some of the things that you can find sometimes in 5e books that make the conversion harder. Like I said, with the creatures that are just like, well, this only kind of mostly has multi-attack and not much else. All the dinosaurs in Dr. Drollin's dictionary had several other abilities, which already makes it, I would say, in a better situation. So it probably should be fine in either direction.
Well, if you would like a Pathfinder converter for the sequel, I'd be happy to get cracking on that once I've got this one done. Just let me know.
I'll keep that in mind.
All right. So thanks for joining us, everybody who's watching. Thanks for joining us, Linda and Nathan. And with that, I will say our outro, which is, until next time, if you want to battle the zoo, you have to roll for combat. Take care, everyone. Bye.